The opening of Beethoven's Sixth Symphony represents an arrival in the countryside, and it stands to reason. The harmony is mostly root position 1, 4, 5, the simplest, the most natural harmonies there are, with root position chords to represent the natural. But if we want music to sound sophisticated, we have to use inverted chords as well. That's the focus of this week's lesson. Let's do some analysis. We'll start with an excerpt from Galuppi's opera Il mondo alla roversa. A few harmonies have already been labeled, so our task will be to identify the remaining harmonies, which are shown here as blanks. They're all either 1 chords or 5 chords, either in root position or first inversion. To help with the analysis, I encourage you to focus on the bass line. I'll play the recording, and it may be helpful to sing along with the bass line using fixed do solfege, so your starting note is do. This is my analysis of the harmonies in the passage. I wanted to draw your attention to 2 moments in particular. Bar 2, second half of the bar, we could say it's 1-6 and then root position 1 at the very end. I've chosen just to show 1-6 for the entire beat. Bar 5, the end of the first line. You could call that a 5 triad, but since we do have an F in the melody, sol, fa, mi, re, mi, I hear that F as introducing a 7th into the chord, making it a 5-7 chord, and I would hear that 7th as resolving when we change harmony on the downbeat of 6, F resolving to E flat, even though there are some other notes in between. That's generally the way we think about 7ths of 5-7 chords resolving. So I'd like to pose 2 questions as we listen once more. First question, which type of cadence does this excerpt end with? And secondly, which parts of this excerpt do we see most of our first inversion chords in? And which parts of it do we see mostly root position chords in? Think about those 2 questions as we listen once again. The end of this excerpt is a perfect authentic cadence. Why? Because it's root position 5 going to root position 1, and the melody note for that root position 1 is the tonic note. Perfect authentic cadence. I want to emphasize that cadences involve root position chords, whether it's a half cadence on root position 5, or an authentic cadence, root position 5 going to root position 1. You may have noticed by now in the course the beginnings of pieces, beginnings of sections, beginnings of phrases, at least in the music we've been looking at, tend to start with root position chords, because that's the most stable place that a section could begin on. And cadences, the ends of phrases, the ends of sections, also tend to involve root position chords. That means that we're going to tend to find inverted chords, such as first inversion chords, in middles of things. If you look at this passage, there's quite a few inverted chords, and they're mostly in the middle. But the very beginning and the very end, we want the stability of root position chords. Let's see if that idea holds up in another passage from the same Galuppi opera. Once again, we're going to be hearing 1 and 5 chords, either in root position or in first inversion. Here's a hint, the 5 chords could be triads or could be 7th chords. So let's have a listen, think about the analysis. Where do we find root position chords and where do we find inverted chords? In quel volta che fa strage So once again, we find root position chords at the beginning and end of the phrase, and quite a few inverted chords in the middle. This passage begins on a root position tonic. That's something we're going to see a lot of in this course. Moves through an inverted dominant. That's 5/6. Then getting into the third bar, it's still dominant harmony, but now we're in root position with B flat in the bass. Then in the middle of the bar, it turns into a seventh chord when we add A flat in the melody. By the very end of that bar, now the seventh of the chord is in the bass. Now it's a 5/4/2 chord. 4/2 chord meaning the seventh of the chord is in the bass. Think about how sevenths of dominant sevenths resolve. We know they move down by step as we change harmony, so that A flat is going to move down to G. Now I'm in bar 4. That G in the bass means this is a tonic chord in first inversion, 1/6. That's a pattern you'll see quite a lot in this course. 5/4/2 tends to resolve to 1/6, and the reason is the seventh of the chord in the bass moves down by step, and we end up with a first inversion tonic chord. Continuing along, now we're at the end of bar 4. We have a root position 1 chord. Moving the next bar to root position 5/7 chords. So we can have root position chords in the middles of phrases. It's absolutely possible. So in bar 5, the seventh of that 5/7 chord is in the soprano. So where is that A flat, that seventh chord, going to resolve? That's going to resolve down by step to G. Now we're in bar 6. And now we're beginning to approach the cadence. We have 1 moves to 1/6. Then we move to 2/6. That's our subdominant function chord. Moving to root position 5 and then root position 1. That's our dominant and tonic to make a perfect authentic cadence. Let's listen to this passage once more. I'd like you to really focus on the sevenths of dominant seventh chords. So every time you hear an A flat that's part of a dominant seventh chord, think about when does that A flat resolve down to G, whether it's in the melody, in the bass, or in an inner voice. Really want to pay attention to those sevenths of dominant seventh chords.
In quel volta fede un nome che fa stralgere mio cor.
Turning now to a short excerpt from the opera Alceste by Lully, I'd like you to listen for two things. Number one, can you find a 5/4/2 chord, a dominant chord in third inversion? Secondly, I've shown an arrow over a note toward the end of the piece in the melody. What type of embellishing tone is that note? Is that a passing tone? Is it an appoggiatura? How can we label that note? Let's have a listen, think about those two questions, looking for a 5/4/2 chord, and what type of note is shown with the arrow. Considering the analysis, I'd like to point out once again we have a passage that begins with root position chords, ends with root position chords, but we find inverted chords tend to be in middles, in the middle of a phrase, in the middle of a section. As far as a 5/4/2 chord, how about the very end of bar 2? The second half of that bar is a 5 chord, but the very end we have an F in the bass. That F is the seventh of a chord. 5/4/2. And when that F resolves down to E as we change harmony over the bar line, that E in the bass means it's a first inversion 1 chord. So this is something to get used to. 5/4/2 goes to 1/6. That's just the way it works out. How about toward the end of the piece, we have that C with the arrow in the fourth bar. It's a 5 harmony, so the D in the melody with the trill belongs to that 5 harmony, but that C at the very end of the bar seems to come a little bit before the harmony that we resolve to at the end, because this is an anticipation. And a very common place to hear anticipations is at cadences, as in this example. Instead of 2/1, we have 2/1/1, where the melody gets there a little bit early to the note that properly belongs on the downbeat with the change of harmony. Let's listen to this passage just one more time. Now let's do some analysis of a passage from a comic aria by the composer Sophie Gail.
Ta fanchette charmante, dans sa simplicité.
Two things to focus on in this passage. I've mentioned a few times the idea that we tend to find inverted chords in the middle of phrases. Another way to think about that, or a way to add a little bit of an idea on top of that, is often inverted chords help us to make what I'm going to call a tonic expansion. What I mean by that is we start on a tonic chord in bar 1, we return to a tonic chord in bar 3, and what comes in between, the 5-6-5 chord that turns into a root position 5-7 chord, that's not part of a cadence. That's not a 5-1 that makes a cadence. Rather, I'm going to call this an inverted 5 that helps to make a tonic expansion. If you take the bass notes on the downbeats of the first 3 bars, we have B flat, A, B flat. You could almost think of that like a big neighboring progression that helps to expand or to prolong the tonic harmony for 3 bars. Contrasted with, at the end of the passage, we have root position 5 going to root position 1, which we know is a cadential progression. It makes a perfect, authentic cadence. Cadential is the adjective for cadence. So I wanted to relate this idea of inverted chords in middles of phrases as having something to do with the idea that many phrases start on tonic, have a tonic expansion, and then end with a cadential progression. That's the first idea. Second thing I wanted to talk about, when we take a look at bar 2, which is a dominant 7th chord harmony, we've been talking about how the different notes in that dominant resolve. If we think about the 7th of the chord, that's the E flat, we have that sort of in the tenor voice, in sort of the thumb of the piano part, so we have that E flat resolving down to D in bar 3. How about A natural? A natural is also a tendency tone, a sensitive note, because A natural and E flat make a tritone together. Another way to think about it, that A natural is the leading tone. Well, take a look at the end of bar 2. We have A natural in the top voice of the piano part, and that A natural resolves up to B flat. So we have this idea that that tritone between A and E flat is going to tend to resolve in contrary motion. The leading tone goes up, that's A up to B flat, and the 7th of the chord goes down, that's E flat down to D. Let's listen once more and pay attention to those tendency tones, that tritone, and how it resolves.
Ta fanchette charmante, dans sa simplicité.
Josephine Auernhammer is probably best known as being a piano student of Mozart's and dedicatee of some of his music, but she was also a composer in her own right. Let's analyze this passage from a theme and variations for piano that she wrote. One question to think about. I've mentioned in some earlier videos that typically a change of note in the bass means a change of harmony or change of inversion. Is that the case here? Does every bass note represent a new harmony, a new Roman numeral, a new inversion? So in this case, we have a left hand in the piano using what's called Alberti bass, the sort of arpeggio figure, da-da-da-da-dum sort of thing, where for each group of notes, we can take the lowest note, often the first note, as the true bass note. So at the very beginning, B flat is our bass note, root position B flat chord. F, D, F, Those are inner voice tones. It wouldn't make sense and it wouldn't be helpful to write 1, 164, 16, 1. Let's just call that whole thing root position 1 until we have a true change of bass note where we have an F in the bass. I've marked the 5-7 chord, and so on. Once again, we see a pattern we've been seeing quite a lot today, where the passage begins and ends with root position chords. When we have first inversion chords, those tend to appear in the middles of things. In bar 3, we have a 5-6-5 chord. I just want to underscore the A in the bass is the leading tone, and the E flat in the melody is a tritone away, is the 7th of the chord. Those are our two tendency tones. Notice how the A in the bass resolves up to B flat when we move from 5-6-5 to 1, and the E flat in the melody moves down to D at the same time. So there, once again, we have those tendency tones, A and E flat, resolving in contrary motion as we move from 5-6-5 to 1. Here we have a short excerpt from a flute sonata by Jacques-Martin Hotteterre. As was typical for many Baroque composers, sonatas were published for solo instrument and continuo, meaning a bass line with figures. And the performer of that bass line was expected to realize the harmony based on the figures, the numbers underneath the score. Let's have a listen, and as we listen, think about what the harmonies are. As you know, if nothing's written underneath a bass note, that means a root position triad. If there's just a sharp written, that means a root position triad where the third above the bass is raised. Often in minor, the reason we're raising a note is to ensure we have a leading tone. If you see other numbers, 6, 6-5, 4-2, and so on, those are there to indicate inversions, or another way to think of it is intervals above the bass. Let's listen to the passage and think about the harmonies. All right, so we start, as we've seen in many examples, with root position tonic, moving on the downbeat to root position 5, then through 5-4-2. I didn't bother to write the 4-2 since 4-2 is already there in the figures. On the 5-4-2 chord, we have the 7th of the chord in the bass, that's C, and the leading tone in the soprano, that's F sharp, so that's our tritone, our tendency tones, and it resolves outward, F sharp up to G, C down to B flat. That's our 1-6 chord. Continuing to the end of the bar, 5-6-5, and we have the opposite situation. F sharp in the bass, C in the melody. Once again, that's our tritone, and this time it resolves inward, contrary motion. F sharp up to G, C down to B flat, and finally to root position 5 for our half cadence. Now, how about this idea that inverted chords tend to appear in middles of phrases? How can we amplify that and connect that to this idea of tonic prolongation? The green arrows show a technique that our book describes as voice exchange. As we move from the initial tonic triad to the 1-6 chord, notice that the notes in the outer voices swap. So at the very beginning, we have G in the bass, B flat in the soprano. When we get to the 1-6 chord, we have B flat in the bass and G in the soprano. And as we move to the next downbeat, we once again have G in the bass and B flat in the soprano. This is often evidence that the tonic is being expanded, the tonic is being prolonged, that the tonic is, so to speak, the main harmony or the governing chord for this passage of music. Often, inverted chords are used to help with this tonic expansion. So if you take a look at this whole expansion section, we start with root position tonic, have some chords that help to expand tonic until we get back to root position tonic, and then we move root position tonic to root position dominant for our cadential progression to make the half cadence. This lines up with an idea I've been emphasizing today about root position chords coming at beginnings of phrases and at ends where the cadences are. Middles are where we tend to find more inverted chords, often because those inverted chords are helping to flesh out the tonic expansion. Let's listen to this short passage just once more. We'll end today with this passage from a Haydn piano sonata. I'll give you a clue before we listen to it, which is to think about the structure of these 8 measures. How many phrases are there? Where are their cadences? Once we know where phrases begin and end, we know where to expect to find root position chords, and, given the theme of today's lesson, maybe we can look then in the middles to try to find some inverted chords. So something we've seen already quite a lot in this course is what I'm going to call a parallel period, an antecedent and consequent structure. Often the antecedents end with a weak cadence, like an imperfect authentic cadence or a half cadence. What kind of cadence do we have in bar 4? And the consequent phrases typically end with a stronger cadence, PAC. Is that what we have here in bar 8? Let's listen again, and I'd like you to think about not only which types of cadences we have in bar 4 and bar 8, but also how is the tonic expanded using inverted chords, using some of the techniques that we've been studying today in the middles of these 4-bar phrases. So we have an antecedent moving from 1 to 5 for a half cadence. That 1 is expanded. 1 moves through 5-4-2 to 1-6, and then through 5-6-5 back to 1. If you look at each of those inverted dominants, you can find some of the tendency tones. So the 5-4-2 chord, we have F in the bass, resolving down to E. Usually that F would form a tritone pair with a B natural. Here Haydn left that note out, so the B natural is implied as part of that 5-4-2 chord. In bar 3 we have 5-6-5. We have B in the bass, an F in the melody, that's a tritone. The B leading tone goes up to C, and the F goes down to E, and so on. In the consequent phrase, once again we have 1-5-4-2, 1-6 as an expansion of tonic. And this time we move through 4, that's our subdominant harmony, to 5-7, that's our dominant harmony, to 1, that's our tonic harmony, to make our cadence. So a more complete analysis could look like this. Both the antecedent and the consequent phrases begin with tonic expansions and end with cadential progressions. The tonic expansions involve inverted chords. For instance, in the antecedent, we move from 1 through 5-4-2 to 1-6. Going from 1 to 1-6, the outer voices exchange the notes C and E. Then we move from 1-6 through 5-6-5 to 1, and the outer voices once again exchange the notes C and E. Then we have root position 1, root position 5 for our cadential progression leading to the half cadence. Similar idea in the consequent. 1 moves through 5-4-2 to 1-6 with a voice exchange. Then we have a cadential progression, root position 4, root position 5-7, 1 to make a PAC. This bass line we have leading to the PAC, E, F, G, C, scale degree 3, 4, 5, 1, is quite common as a bass line leading to perfect authentic cadences. Let's listen to the passage one last time. We've already seen in previous videos many of the passages we study begin with root position chords and end at cadences which use root position chords. We know that cadences involve root position 5s and often root position 1s. So now that we're studying inverted chords, we'll find that they tend to fall in middles, often as parts of tonic expansions. and sometimes involving voice exchanges that help to expand the tonic chord. Many of the phrases we've looked at have involved long tonic expansions, and then very close to the end we have dominant tonic to make a cadence. When we're dealing with 5 or 5/7 chords, we need to think about the tendency tones. If it's a 5/6 chord, first inversion triad, you just need to think about the leading tone, which is going to resolve up. If we have a 5/6/5 or a 5/4/2 chord, those are both 7th chords, we need to think now about two tendency tones. The leading tone is going to go up, and the 7th of the chord is going to go down. So think of those two notes as a pair. They make a tritone. They're going in opposite directions, contrary motion, either toward each other or away from each other, depending on how the harmony is organized. Notice today we haven't dealt with second inversion chords. So when we talked about triads, we didn't deal with 5/6/4 chords. When we talked about 7th chords, we didn't deal with 5/4/3 chords. We're saving second inversion chords for a later week since they're a little trickier, they behave in a different way. So today we just dealt with 5/6, 5/6/5, and 5/4/2. Hope this helps get more of a sense of the way composers integrate inverted chords so they can give their bass lines more shape, more variety of notes, and have a more artful organization compared to perhaps the simplicity that we might hear if we have only root position chords. Have a nice week.